welcome to this episode of the Gig Harbor Flycast, and today we have George Cook, the Sage Rod Manufacturing Rep, with us today. Is that your official title? Do you have an official title?
Pacific Northwest Sage Farbank Rep.
Farbank
All
Rep.
three brands, as you well know. Sage, Rio, Reddington.
But the one that counts.
Well, they all count, good sir. They all count. But, Sage being the preeminent one,
right.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. But really excited to talk about just some funny stories and some stuff from George. I want to talk about spey casting. We'll talk about trout fishing. I think we should talk about lake fishing, too. We'll talk about lake fishing. Yeah, we have a rough draft of where we're going, but it'll be good where we're going. We know that. And then we're going to do a second episode where we're going to talk about some new stuff from Sage and Reddington, but not in this episode. We're not talking about any new stuff in this episode.
That's its own episode.
That's its own. Cool. So, George, you invented fly fishing, right?
No,
but you've been around since.
I met one of the forefathers of things, though, when I was a little kid. When I was 11 years old, I met Joe Brooks.
Yeah?
In Last Chance, Idaho. I got him to sign my freshly bought Joe Brooks trout fishing book. I waltzed over at breakfast and asked Mr. Brooks if he'd sign my book, which he gladly did. So that was a pretty cool moment in time.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And you were out fishing the Henry's Fork?
I was fishing the Henry's Fork.
When you were 11?
Yep.
Wow.
My first day of fly fishing is a good one. I told this story here recently. My mother worked at Henry's Lake Lodge, which was on Henry's Lake, which is part of Island Park. And I was 11. I had a fly rod. I had a very, rudimentary skill set. I was dropped off in Last Chance. 11-year-old Georgie was dropped off with a sandwich and 6 green drake dry flies. 6. I would need all 6. By 5 p.m., I was dropped off at 8 by a guide buddy of mine, an older guy. Dropped my dumb ass off. He said, I'll see you at 6. And here's your 6 green drakes. By 5 p.m., I had lost all 6 green drakes to pretty good rainbows on that ditch. I walked across the street to Will Godfrey's fly shop.
Yeah.
And I had just enough money in my 11-year-old pockets to buy 2 standard Adams, walk back to the ditch, and continue the quest. That was day one. Day one. True story, lad.
Yeah, I mean, your stories are unbelievable. But so I was going to say this one for later, but we just got to have to jump into this one. So I was telling George this story about being out on the Bitterroot River. And the thing that I appreciate about George is that he has nicknames for everything. And I told him, I said, I saw the weirdest thing swim across the river that I've just never seen before. And we were floating the river with my family, and it was just starting to get dusk. Sun was going down, and we see a disturbance in the water, and all of a sudden we see something moving across the water, and there's 2 bunny ears going across. And he's like, "Oh, you saw Bun Bun?" So he's like, "I've seen Bun Bun." So you got to tell your Bun Bun experience from Alaska.
Oh yeah. A few years ago, my wife and I are fishing on the Nishgak, which I've guided on the 1980s, and I tend to go up there every year for the King Run, spey rod game, and we've got a particular spot that we call Bug Island, and it's called Bug Island for a reason, because once you are out of the water and on the island, you will be killed by bugs. I mean, it is death by 1,000 cuts if it exists anywhere. And one day we're coming down the run, and it's an island in the river, and the river's huge. And I hear this splashing sound. And as a former Alaska guide, and I've hunted Alaska extensively, I thought, what's on the other side of the river? Because I can hear it, and it's clearly in the water. And I'm on an island, or I'm near an island, which means the island is our separator. And I thought, it's Boo Boo. It's got to be Boo Boo. Boo Boo's coming to visit. Or maybe it's a moose, or possibly a caribou. And so my wife hears it, and I get out of the water, And she goes, "You're going to walk over there?" And I go, "Might as well see what's coming." And I walk over there, and it's the islands. You know, it's 25 yards across, and I don't get but halfway across. And here is a snowshoe hare swimming towards the bank. He spots me, and he does a U-turn and swims out and around to the next island up. And I go back and tell her this, and I'm sure she thinks I'm as full of shit as a Christmas goose. But I said it was Bun Bun. He was coming, and he detoured, and he's up on the next island. So if you don't believe me, you can go up there and find him. But he was swimming, and he was making enough noise to have been a small bear. So that's my Bun Bun story.
When you used more nicknames when you told me the story originally, because you were fishing for
Kingy.
Bobo.
Kingy.
For Kingy.
Yeah, on the
So
niche.
do you have a nickname for Moose?
Moosey.
Moosey, just Moosey.
Good old Moosey.
Just Moosey.
We get him in the backyard all the time at the Anchorage house. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you weren't fishing for Bobo.
Well, Bobo, I do fish plenty for Bobo. I was in Idaho last week fishing for Bobo, and I caught a big Bobo.
Yeah.
Which we're not even going to show anybody. It's so big.
Do you want to tell the story about that one?
Just giant Bobo.
It is giant Bobo.
25 pounds. Weighed. Yep.
Yeah.
That's not fake news, folks.
I've seen the picture. I don't know. It might have been photoshopped.
I don't know.
It looked more like a BC steelhead than a rainbow, but it was pretty darn
career
big.
fish, sir.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
so
critters get nicknames.
So you've been career-wise, you've been in the fly fishing industry for a few years. You started off with Kaufman's, and I had someone talked about Kaufman's the other day. Who was it? Oh, I had a customer. We were out in Forks, and their comment, they were like, "Your shop reminds me of Kaufman's." I'm like, "I'll take that as a compliment."
Yeah, roll with it.
I mean, sure. Well, I'll go with that. But so you started working at Kaufman's. I mean, this is like in the 80s, right?
1982. But if we take a step back, Blake, I taught fly casting on a university level at Washington State University. And
when you were 11?
No. No, when I was in college at Washington State at Harvard West. And when we weren't drinking, which was a fair amount of the time over there in Coogville, we actually did go to class, and I got to teach class. And I taught this class under Dave Ingebretson, who at the time was the Western editor of Fly Fisherman magazine. And I'd seen Dave on the Henry's Fork. I saw a lot of famous people on the Henry's Fork.
Yeah.
I would typically see Dave Ingebretson every year. I'd see Ernie Schwiebert. I'd see Doug Swisher. It was like the MLB All-Star game of fly fishing that you could witness during the green drake catch on the Henry's Fork. And, I fished there for years. I fished there from the time I was 11 till I think I was 25 every year, every summer. Never missed one. So I was somewhat of a child authority on the
Do you still go back?
Oh, yeah. When I'm over there, I'm there.
Okay.
Yeah, when I'm over in that part of the country. And I was there definitely during the heyday of the big fish. I saw some things that, were pretty memorable in terms of big fish and opportunity with dry fly fishing. But nevertheless, one day I walked into Dave Ingebretson's his office at Washington State. He taught anatomy and fly fishing. And I waltzed into his office one fall and knocked on his door. He let me in. And I said, Mr. Ingebretson, I know who you are. I see you on the Henry's Fork every year, down there by the fence and the entrance to what's called the Railroad Ranch. And I said, you ever thought about having a TA, teacher's assistant for your class, your fly fishing class? He looks at me and he says, nope. But I think it's a good idea. I'll see you in February. So nice. I proceeded to be his TA for 3 straight years.
Wow.
In that, which didn't hurt my resume, of which I handed to Randall Kaufman.
Sure.
In that time period to get a summer job at Kaufman's.
Yeah.
And I would go on to work at Kaufman's for the Kaufman brothers. And my sales manager at Sage, my longtime sales manager, it seems like I've known him since I was 13, and I've worked for him my entire adult life, Mr. Mark Bale, smartest man I know, was my manager there. He's my manager at Sage. I reckon I could say he's stalking me, or he could say I'm stalking him for, good Lord, 30 plus years.
Yeah.
So we had quite the crew at Kaufman's. Mark was there then, Bill Martz, myself, John Farrar, the originator of the Snap T-Cast globally. We were all there at once. John Kovich, who's a rep and heavily involved in the travel business. Your Cuba trip is often, led by him.
Yeah.
He worked there, so Kaufman's at one time, I used to call it the AAA baseball affiliate of fly fishing.
Oh, man, you've mentioned baseball now twice, and it's like each time it almost brings a tear to my eye with the whole coronavirus thing. It's delaying the start of baseball. It's killing me.
Well,
it's killing me.
It's giving the Mariners more time to get ready. To not have a 70-win season and maybe somehow get to 90, yeah?
I have tickets for that are for a game coming up April 13th against the Nationals, but
the champs.
It ain't happening. That's not happening.
Well, that game will probably come to pass, and you'll get to go. I went to one game last year.
Yeah.
In the month of September when they retired Ichiro.
Oh yeah,
and
cool.
It was awesome. I mean, they did an awesome presentation, a big screen film of nothing but Ichiro highlights.
Yeah.
They had Edgar, they had Junior, they had Buhner. They were all there. It was a fantastic night at the ballpark. I believe they played the White Sox, and they won that night. I think they won. I think it was either 1-0 or 2-1.
Yeah, it's super exciting.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah.
It was fabulous.
Okay, so you're a Mariners fan.
Oh, you got to be.
Oh, okay.
True to the blue.
Right. Yeah. Love it.
Yeah.
So I'm enjoying watching their young guys that they have.
Well,
they have some promise.
Yeah, they've got some. They got a bunch.
Yeah. Okay, but this isn't a baseball podcast.
All right.
It's fly fishing. Okay, so you mentioned the Snap Tee, and I actually had a Spey client recently that had been on a trip with a guide, and this guide was all over him because he wasn't doing the Spey cast correctly, the way that he invented it. And
who might that be?
Wait, we don't even need to get into that, but because it was a really funny conversation that we had. But man, you've been involved in Spey casting since like the beginning of Skagit style, type of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of us that are into Spey casting that have been that have been into it since maybe the last 5, 10, 15 years, fairly disconnected from a lot of those, the kind of the story of the beginnings of that. I mean, share a little bit about how that kind of started in our area and how that developed, and some of the players. I was recently rereading Deck's book, A Passion for Steelhead, and it was just great to like read about him talking about some of the. He mentions you a couple different times in there about just kind of developing casts and different lines and sink tips and like kind of all this different stuff with what you guys had to deal with the rods and the technology that you had at the time. And it's come so far since then, so
mega, it's been mega.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So,
well, sure. I'll give you some background. So, Deck was, really the tip of the spear, if you will. Him and a small group of dedicated steelheaders. And what's interesting with Deck, he'll probably get a kick out of it if he sees this. I'll make sure he sees it. He was working at Boeing, and I had him on a guide trip. I guided him and Scott O'Donnell, which both of them had been in the Navy. And they were post-military service. Deck was at Boeing. I forget what Scott was doing. he was probably, eating top ramen and steelhead, and him and Ed Ward both, But I guided those two guys on the Isaac Ranch in Eastern Washington. Back to the Wall is the name of it nowadays. And both of them were ready to make a breakaway from the public sector to the guide sector. And I had the good fortune of guiding those two. And they were they are characters, both of them. Absolutely both of them. They both had the classic sailor's mouth, particularly Scott. And I saw two guys that were ready to break free and to go give the guide game a go. And this was 1989, if I remember right. I'm pretty sure it was 89. And they were talking about it, and they both did it. And they jumped out of that sector into the guide sector, both of them. And Dex accelerated very quickly. Scott's was a little slower, but Scott's, on the back end would be a huge trajectory. Scott would make a huge name for himself both in Washington State and Oregon as well as Alaska. And still guiding to this day in Oregon, in the state of Alaska. And this coincided with the Spey game. Jimmy Green, of Fenwick fame, a great advisor to Don Green, the co-founder of Sage. Jimmy was over there on the Grand Ron and the main stem snake, getting the Spey thing started. And the early roots to the Spey thing here in Washington State was coming out of British Columbia, largely from a guy named Mike Maxwell. And the influence here started to really show up around 1990, 91. And at that time, tackle was, rods weren't a problem. We had rods. Sage was making rods. TNT was making Spey rods at that time. Those were probably your two main players.
Were most of those for the international market?
Absolutely. They were Scandinavia, United Kingdom aimed, be it Norway, be it Iceland, pick your country on the map over there. And they were dominated by 14-foot 9 weights, 15-foot 10 weights. Rods that today you would rarely, if ever, see. I mean, you could be on your Olympic Peninsula guide season, Blake, and maybe not see a single 14.9, a 91.40, or a 10.150. You'd see 8 weights, you'd see 7s, you'd see the odd 6. You might see a short 9, but you wouldn't see these behemoth sticks that the game started with. A 91.40, a 14 for 9 was the most common steelhead rod the first 5 years of the steelhead Spey revolution in Washington, Oregon.
It's probably been a couple of years since maybe 2 years since I've seen one. We have customers that bring them into the shop every once in a while.
Yeah,
they're like,
got one.
I got this thing, from a buddy or used or whatever. And
that's what we were lugging around. I mean, a 91.40 was your default steelhead stick, and it could have been on the Skycomas, the Sauk, Skagit, Ho, somebody going to the Deschutes, Grand Ron, Idaho's Clearwater. That was your rod. And your lines were the limitation. The lines were the limitation. In 1992, Jim Vincent, the founder of Rio, brought a line to the table called a wind cutter. And like a lot of the Spey lines of today, that line was hatched in what I call the line doctors working late nights in the depths of their garage with various tools that they could splice things together, in between scotch. They could do these things. And the wind cutter came to the table in 1992 as a 53-foot Spey line with an interchangeable tip system. The very first ones were full floaters. I had my mitts. I traded a guy from Boulder, Colorado by the name of Dr. Cliff Watts. And virtually, only a percentage of people that listen or see this podcast will know who that guy is. But if you go back enough issues in Fly Fisherman magazine, you will see a cover of a guy with a cowboy hat holding a 28, 30-pound steelhead from the Skeena system. If you go back enough covers, you'll run into this, and that's Cliff Watts. Brought out a fairly famous fly that Umpqua has called a kilowatt.
Yeah.
And I got him to build me 3 lines for the Spey rod of his choice. Worst monetary trade of my life, but I got something that was basically unattainable. I got 3 wind cutters, and I got them in different sizes to run on a 61-26, a 71-26, and a 91-40 rod. And so I had these lines that were tomorrow's line today.
When was this?
1992.
92.
Summer
Wow.
92. I made this infamous trade that would even shock the sports world that I gave up that rod for those lines. But those lines took us from running around with double taper 9 or 10.
Yeah.
Or the Wolf Company, Royal Wolf Company, the legacy of Lee Wolf,
Yeah.
had a line called, it was a triangle taper Spey, and it was pretty good. It was actually, I think it was an 83-foot taper, if I remember right. And that line was actually showing some pretty good promise, but none of these lines, till the wind cutter,
Yeah.
were bringing us the ability to throw sink tips. And once that wind cutter showed up, 53-foot taper, a loop at 15 feet, and then on the commercial deal, you had a loop at 30 feet. And so we played conventional 15-foot tips off that first interchangeable section. Now we were rifle hunting.
Yeah. Okay, so for people
rifle
listening in that, they're like, they hear 53, 80, and they don't understand why that's a deal. I love talking with you about fly line tapers and stuff like that. I mean, why was that such an important shift with that line being at 53 instead of double tapers or the taper and all that kind of stuff? I mean, like when we talk about tapers and ease of casting and stuff like that, I mean,
Well, if you think about just the easy way to take any angler, fly fisherman, and say, okay, well, what did all this mean? So in single-handed rods, if you go back to, let's go back to sometime in the 70s, you had level fly lines.
that was my first fly line.
That was my first fly line that I was running around on a Henry's fork with,
Yeah.
on a South Bend fly rod, which was actually a combo spin fly rod that I had the fly rod handle in with a weight forward. It wasn't even a weight forward, it was level 6 line.
Yeah.
But it was good enough. I could cast X distance, and I was in the ball game, right?
Yeah.
But you had a level line, which today would be a running line for some shooting head of
Right.
some sort,
Right.
if at all. You had double tapers, if
Yeah.
you could find one. And you had some level of weight forward lines out there, although they had really not super hit the bullseye yet. But a weight forward is the most common fly line sold in any fly shop globally today.
Yeah, easily.
So if you take that concept that you've got this aggressive head, and that head could be 30 feet, could be 34 or 5 feet, could be 38, could be 48. But let's just say, a pronounced head. This idea had come to Spey lines in the form of the wind cutter.
And so to be clear, what we're talking about is the plastic that is of the fly line has a thickness difference. It changes.
But it has a taper.
It has and
Okay.
it tapers, and
Yeah.
so because some people don't realize that fly lines actually change diameter
Yes.
down the length of the line, and for different
That
purposes.
creates
of
a taper.
presentation and stuff like that. Yeah.
In a weight forward manner is going to give you the most projected ability to cast beyond common trout flies. Okay, it certainly will cast common trout flies, but it'll throw streamers, it'll throw bass bugs, it'll throw various saltwater endeavor. And in the Spey theater, we had to find some way to throw sink tips for starters and steelhead flies, which at that time, were common things. It could have been something traditional like a Skycoma sunrise, a polar
Yeah.
shrimp, or maybe the popsicle, which, as you know, yours truly sitting here
Yeah.
came up with. And those flies were the winter steelhead flies of that era. But that group of guys, Deck, Ed Ward, Scott O'Donnell, Scott Howell, Darth Vader himself, and Mike Kinney, John Farrar, Jim Vincent, all these guys, John Hazel, Mark Bachman down in Oregon, these guys were putting together Jerry French. I got to be careful not to miss one of these guys or I'll get a knock on the door, right?
Right.
These guys were at the forefront of both Spey line development as well as fly development. So the wind cutter that Jim Vincent brought to the table opened up Spey rods to become very practical steelhead tools, and then would show up in BC and Alaska for Chinook.
Yeah.
But it also set the stage for sink tip lines, which previously the Spey rod had been confined to either a full floating or, God forbid, a full sinking line that were popular in Europe, but really too arduous to even really think about as true Northwest Spey lines. Even though they were successful in Europe, but it certainly wasn't what we were looking for. And I could go into reasons why things differ between Atlantic salmon angling and steelhead Chinook angling in terms of presentation, mending, not mending, mending upstream to slow fly, mending downstream to speed up fly. Needless to say, a full sinking line had complications. So the wind cutter opened up a weight forward taper in a Spey line, opened up the sink tip avenue, which certainly opened up winter steelheading at a level that had not been accomplishable with a Spey rod. Was still the favorite territory of a 9.5 foot, 10 foot 8 weight with a good old teeny 300 grain sink tip on it. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Skagit line would become the huge revolution, the revolution.
What year was that?
That group of those guys I talked about.
Yeah.
Deck.
Okay, commercially available.
Commercially available December 2002. The constituents are trying to check in. December 2002, I remember standing in baggage claim in Dallas, Texas, getting ready to drive to Kansas for the Kansas Rifle Whitetail Opener. And that's an important date. And I've got Jerry Swanson, the buyer from Kaufman's, my alma mater, trying to give me an order. And I'm scrambling to find any sort of piece of paper and a pen in baggage claim in Dallas to write down an order that inevitably I needed that pen plus another pen because it was fixing to hit. And those lines hit late December, January, so December 2002, January 2003. And now it was on. It was fixing to be on like Donkey Kong.
Yeah.
We had a Skagit line. We could really throw sink tips, but what we could really do was those same lads who had brought the Skagit to life, the chop shop artist, the inner sanctum. Those guys were bringing the intruder fly to the table at the same time. Now, granted, the intruder was held as, state secrets. It said Fort Knox and no one's getting into Fort Knox, right? I mean, to the point where Scott Howe and Ed Ward would famously, see you coming down the riverbank, cut it off into the pocket, standing there.
Really?
Holding a flyless Spey rod. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
No, these guys were keeping this out of not just public view, but any view.
Yeah.
This into the pocket. I mean, these guys did this and did it for quite a while. But we were going to have a Skagit line, which is why the Chop Shop boys had been working on it. Why Ed Ward had been working on it. Why Scott Howell, Donald, all these guys. Mike Kinney, all of them. And they were all up there guiding on the Sauk and Skagit, so they were Jerry French, all of them. They were kind of a close-knit community, And so that Skagit line was a byproduct of the intruder. The intruder was a byproduct of the Skagit line. And those things would come on board. And now, as Scott O'Donnell once famously said, that I rattle off all the time in talks, is Scott, stood around and said, "We're fishing plug water now, boys." And so the Spey angler went from fishing just classic runs that were always there, were always productive, to looking at water that, was really gear water. And now we had a crack at gear water because we could fish sink tips, the heaviest ones out there, which would lead to heavier ones being available, T14 and that group, with this new fly that was an intruder with large barbell eyes that would sink and sink big time, and was tied in such a way to sink and swim and do everything that we all take for granted in that pile of steelhead flies you got out there in those trays. So there's the roots. I mean, I've had people say to me, Scott Howe being one, that George, your popsicle and your showgirl and your blue moon kind of set the stage for this, and maybe it did. It certainly was revolutionary in Alaska in 1982, 83, 84, 85. But the intruder has revolutionized winter steelhead fishing, summer Chinook fishing, no doubt.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Man, I feel like I just got a PhD in Spey history.
You did. That's 101. There's 202 through 505. Sign up today.
Yeah. Okay. So, just to pick your brain a little bit on sink tips, we sell a lot of the Mo tips. Do you fish the Mo tips, or do you kind of custom cut your own stuff?
Well, I can give a class on custom cut, right? So, and maybe I'll mention that here in a minute. But the Mo's, which a lot of people just don't realize what does Mo mean. Well, so for the tentative, Mo means Mo shit for you. But what Mo really means is Mike McCune, the M, Scott O'Donnell, the O, the W, Ed Ward, MOW, or as I call them, the three Speyketeers. Those guys brought this idea to the table, and what had happened was, again, the chop shop artists were at work developing these things. And what those guys found out, which others of us found out independently but didn't take it as far as they did, is that on a Spey rod, regardless of size, generally speaking, you can take trout Spey and you could play a 7.5 foot sink tip where you custom cut T8. You could play 7.5 on trout Spey, maybe on a switch rod as a baby Spey. But once you hit a conventional Spey rod, let's just call that 12 feet north, 12 to 15. The minute you play a sink tip under 9 feet, you have a boomerang in your hand. It's going to do some weird stuff out there. It's gonna crash. It's going to do what we call the tumble, where the sink tip hits and the head kind of rolls up past it, and you start to question, do you even know how to cast? And you thought you knew how to cast, but the way this thing would lay out would just make you question that. So what those boys were first to the table with was the idea that we want some shorter sink tips. We want a 7.5 foot critter. We want a 5 foot critter. We want a little sneaky 2.5 footer. Well, the only way to get those sink tips to function cast-wise was to create something off a common denominator. Well, we know 9 foot will cast. A 9 foot sink tip will cast off a sink tip. Once you drop below 9, squirrely. 10 feet, cast even better. So those guys were, and they are, we as anglers owe a huge level of debt to those guys for what they brought to the table, and to some degree continue to bring to the table. 10 foot was a common denominator. So by splicing 7.5 foot, 5 foot, 2.5 feet of sink tip to an appropriate length of floating line to hit a common denominator of 10 feet, hence 7.5 by 2.5, 5 by 5, 2.5 by 7.5, blah, 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 we could have these little sneaky sink tips. And
Now,
these
don't
things,
those tips help like new anglers too? Because I think of like with the Spey cast being a fixed length cast compared to the single hand cast, which is a variable length cast. That fixed length cast, when you're a newer angler and you have anchor placement and you're creating that D loop and all that stuff, it feels like for those new anglers, if they change from a 10-foot to a 5.5, or it keeps that cast, that stroke more consistent. Now, I mean, depth of water, that
Sure.
is going to alter things, but I feel like it takes a variable out for those newer anglers that are just learning the Spey cast. That just kind of helps simplify things for them a little bit.
well, Blake, you guide a lot, so you've got a bird's eye view of that. Now, what George will tell you on that one is that the 12.5-foot mow tip, which is the longest critter in the group, is fundamentally the best casting at 12.5. It's better than 10, and frankly, the old historical 15-foot Rio sink tips are the best casting sink tips in the history of planet Earth. And the reason why they are is they're tapered. They're 15 feet, but they're tapered. And 129 grain, 150 grain type 6 is a fantastic sink tip from a castability standpoint. And typically, because that tip's a little longer at 12.5 or 15 feet, the stick tends to really come in and tends to work for most people most of the time. But really the mow thing, if because when they first came out, Rio agreed to take that for a one-time royalty to that group, to 3 Speyketeers. I called Mike McCune, the M and Mo, and I said, Bud, you got to lay this on me. You got to lay the strategical initiative of what these things really are on me, because we've got 15-foot sink tips. We've got them in intermediate. We got them in type 3, type 6, and I think we had type 8 as well at that time. So between those densities, we could do a lot of things that sounded like these things were going to be the same idea. Turns out the Mo's were a better idea. So McCune, I spoke to Mike, and he talked about places, both in Oregon, Washington, and I would find out Alaska, which would be my first use of the Mo's, that where these things were completely strategical. A good example was water on the Grand Ronde in both the Oregon and Washington side, and as I would find out, water on the Rogue down southern Oregon, where, say you had a 5x5 mow, 5 feet of floating, 5 feet of sinking, and say it was a mow medium, which is based on T11, or a mow heavy, which is based, and if mows were rap singers, heavy mow would be your man. Okay, but say you had the heavy, which is T14, the strategical use of this thing would be a cast that would hit, and immediately, much like hopefully you can see this on camera, that becomes what's going on, is that my
hinge.
forearm, the blue jacket, is the floater, and that's my hand is the 5-foot tip, and that thing hits, down it goes, because there's a lot of watersheds where there's ledge rock.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Umpqua is an obvious one, but there's stuff, the Soul Duck is somewhat of an example of this. Not necessarily in true ledge rock, volcanic that you see in some of these other deals, but still slots, to think of it as slots. And you get on a broad steelhead run, a classic, head, body, tail. Well, we can throw long cast mend and swing across that, because those fish could be anywhere in that, from the head to the tail, and it could be 3 feet in front of you or 103 feet out from you, right? But a lot of these spots where you're dealing with ledge rock and slots, Umpqua, the fish are in those slots.
Yeah.
And you don't have all this, you don't have the big mend and let this thing, engage and come across in this classic.
Well, you better have a lot of flies with you if you do.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because, that's going to bring up point number 2 in a minute. But what that mow did was allow that thing to hit, engage.
Yeah.
Maybe not a big mend because we've got X slot. The slot could literally be this table we're at. And once your fly's out of that slot, your fly just left the stadium. The stadium is that slot. And so those guys had sorted this out, and it was brilliant. It was just nothing short of brilliant. And what I found with a mow, just you like stories, Blake, so here's one.
Yeah.
So I fish the Knack-Knack a lot in Bristol Bay, Alaska. And I have fished it all times of the year. I have fished it in late March when the water's at its lowest. I have fished it in June when water's at its near highest. And I have fished it in the fall where it could kind of do either, okay? And when you fish it in late March, you see parts of the river that you have never seen before. If you've only been there in June or August or October, what you're seeing in March, you have physically never seen. A, it's low. B, things are exposed. So boulder fields, rock gardens. Okay? Bobo likes rock gardens. Steely.
So for people that don't know the Knack-Knack, this is a large river that flows out of a lake, and these are fish that come out of the lake.
Resident rainbows and lake run rainbows, and the lake run rainbows size wise might as well be steelhead.
Yeah, they're steelhead size.
They're steelhead size rainbows, and it's in its own way, it's the Great Lakes of Alaska, right? So, but the point being is in March I was seeing structure that I had never seen in June, nor October, or September. Didn't matter, but I was seeing things. And what I saw in March, I then put into action in June. And I recall the first time I ever fished a mow. I fished a 2.5 by 7.5 foot sinking, which is my favorite one.
Yep.
And I knew this run, and I knew this thing was a rock garden. I knew it was because I had seen it. I'd seen it at low. And I knew if I went in there with a 15-foot sink tip, which I'd done in years past in June, primo, it was getting hung up. Didn't really know why I was getting hung up, other than I was getting hung up. But I would figure out that the rock garden. So that 15-foot tip is going in there and it's draping. It's a big drape, right? And it's coming in there, and let's find something. Here's a pretend boulder, okay? Here's the pretend boulder, and the boulder's like that, right? Well, that sink tip is coming in there, and because it's usually not your fly hung up, it's your sink tip, right? And then when you pull, you're hung up with the sink tip. You pull it. Now you put your fly in there. Now you double hung up.
Now you start to cry a little bit.
Now we're fixing to have some loss. So the beauty of the mow is that the mow in that at higher water, the mow doesn't come in there like this, like the 15-foot sink tip. The mow comes in there like this. And it may hit those rocks, but because it's 5 feet or 7.5 feet a tip, it kind of hits and dribbles over, and it goes in there and it probes and it does stuff. The other thing it does, which I would learn in Alaska, is that you not only got to fish this boulder garden here, but as your fly swung into the bank directly below you in relatively shallow water, let's call it 2 to 4 feet, that fly was still swimming. Whereas with that 15-foot sink tip, by the time that fly got directly below you in that swing, it was bottomed out and it's digging.
Yeah.
In fact, it might dig to the point when it got there, you just ripped it in just so you could not be dragging and getting gack on your fly and having to deal with that.
Yeah.
So, I caught a 29.5-inch rainbow in this particular run that I'd seen in March. I was back on opening day in June, and I was fishing a mow. Now, the $64 question is, Blake, did that fish, was he laying behind one of those boulders, and he followed that fly all the way in and ate it straight below me, which he did, or was he laying there? But the mow was the answer based on either idea, because if he followed it from here to eat here, then my fly didn't get hung up here. It passed through and allowed him the sight pitcher to go follow it.
Yeah.
Or if he was laying there, it was still swimming where he was laying.
Yeah.
So either way, it was a win-win.
Yeah.
And so the Mow system, the whole thing is nothing but brilliance that came out of those three guys.
Wait, so when did that come out? Like 2008?
Right
2009?
in there. And I think it was 2007 or 8. You know, I mean, we could go check, but it was somewhere
around there.
Yeah.
So it's been around.
It's had a decade plus.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've now got longer ones. We've got Mow longs,
Sure.
which are 15-foot, animals that are based off that same grouping.
Right.
And to some degree, those cast better because, again, 15 feet tends to be a fairly kind of magic number in terms of line, stick, and layout. But
so with a 15-foot tip, I have fished 15-foot tips a bit. I've definitely fished just T material more and a lot of 10-foot tips.
Sure.
But it seems like the 15-foot tips really shine on rods that are at a length of 13 and a half. Or what would you say as far as rod length? Because you probably don't want to throw a 15-foot tip on a 12-foot rod. Or maybe you could, depending on what head is on.
On paper, one could say that. In reality, because those 15-foot tips, those conventional, Rio refers to them as replacement tips. At one time, we called them accessory tips. They originally came out to support what was called the Versi tip single-handed line, and then they morphed into the wind cutter grouping and the wind cutter set and blah, blah, blah. It's been with us a long time.
Right.
They're tapered. And you think about 15 feet and you think, man, maybe that's a little long. If it wasn't tapered, meaning you take that T11 and cut 15 feet, that's a different animal than a tapered animal.
Right.
And I even throw them off, baby Spey switch rods. 11 foot 4, 11 foot 6, 11 foot 9 switch rods, which for me, are baby Spey. I'll throw those pups off that, and they work because they're tapered.
So anglers need to make sure that they're looping on the correct end of the tip, the replacement tips.
Well, the good news is with those conventional ones, I think they're only looped on the right end, so you're good. You can't screw that up.
Oh, okay.
Plus, there's a color code. So a Type 3 will have yellow.
Yeah.
Type 6
I think
has
on the
got
old
a grayish
ones, though,
white.
the old ones had like lines on them.
Correct.
Right?
Well,
and that made it a little bit more.
Yeah, but they still had color. The bars signify size, meaning a big bar meant 5 and little bars.
And then it was like Morse
so a big
code
bar,
or something.
well, here's what it meant. A big bar was 5.
Yeah.
Followed by 4 little bars. 5 plus 4 equals 9.
9.
Even the Wazoo student can figure that out. What's 9 mean? 9 weight. 9 weight at 15 feet is 129 grains. So there was a method to the madness.
Yeah.
And Jim Vincent, being a perfectionist and really a brilliant professor of the game, he marked these lines.
Yeah.
And he marked them by the color. So the yellow on the brownish olive looking tip, yellow meant Type 3, and block ... meant 9. What's 9? 9 equates to grain weight, which in that case is 129 grains. And there's little charts for this that actually come on the back of the sink tip. So
or even in the little sink tip wallet.
Yeah, totally. So those 15-foot.
I've never been able to memorize any of this. I always have to look at this stupid thing. I'm like I've looked at it so many times. My eyes have worn holes through the paper, but I still have to look at
it. I couldn't memorize anything in college, but I got all this now.
Yeah. Oh, man. Okay, so, George, we have a lot more to talk about because we have some really fun stuff with talking about
I see
new
something
product.
on there I can't wait for.
Yes. No, we're going to get into that. But we've been chatting for a bit. So thanks for joining us on this episode. Hey, for those of you listening in, this video or this podcast is also available on YouTube as an interview. And George and I will be right back to talk about some new stuff that's coming out from Reddington and Sage, and we're going to talk about
the Panther.
And we're going to talk about the Panther. He has the largest
cat captivity.
Captivity.
That's captivity.
So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about. But you're not just into the Spey game, even though you're like really known for that. You actually do a lot of lake fishing and trout fishing and saltwater stuff.
Bassy.
And
my
bass.
boy Bassy.
Yeah. Wait. So okay. So we're gonna hit stop on this. Thanks for joining us today. Check out our next episode when we talk about some new product that's coming out, as well as some other fun stuff like the Panther and Bassy.